So welcome everybody. It is officially 3:01 p.m., at least according to my Mac. So shall we begin? Norm?
Yes, we will begin. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second virtual Sandhouse meeting. And I understand we potentially have a record crowd here. We had about 125 people sign up, Chris. So obviously they're interested to hear what you have to say.
138. 138.
138. Okay, that's an all-time record, Joan, for a Sandhouse meeting. The Red Purple Line Modernization Program is a very interesting project because essentially the CTA people under Chris's leadership and Graham's involvement in both communications and operating coordination are essentially rebuilding the railroad between Lawrence Avenue and Howard Street. That project originally was, or that section of the railroad originally was on ground level. About 110 years ago, 100 to 110 years ago, they started to elevate it. The elevation was done by building a trestle and then building retaining walls and then filling it in with lake sand mainly, and then building a railroad on the elevated platform. So now basically they are rebuilding the railroad because after 100 years, it's served its purpose and it needs attention. Chris is the project manager, project leader, I should say, the executive in charge of the project. This is his second appearance at a Sandhouse meeting. He did a wonderful, wonderful job the last time, and I was kind of kidding him that he is now Professor Bushell and Bushell, so with that, Professor, would you please give us an update and where we are at on the project these days?
Well, Graham's going to kick us off, but I do want to just add a little bit of context here and really thank my boss, Dorval Carter, the president of the CTA. This project couldn't happen without his continued leadership today, but also his involvement and support of this project over a couple different phases of his career, which included work for the Department of Transportation and for the FTA as well. So he has a long history with this project, and I really would consider him to be the project executive. But certainly Graham and I are advancing the project on a day-to-day basis. So his involvement, Mayor Lightfoot, and before her Mayor Emanuel, were huge supporters of the project, as well as various state and federal partners. So it's been a great ride. It's great to see something like this implemented. And with that, I'll turn it over to Graham, who will get us started on the presentation. But thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Chris. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the project background and some of the history, and then I'll turn it back over to Chris at current conditions, and then Chris will walk through, we'll get the benefit of Chris's amazing knowledge and expertise with not only the project, but previously Chris was the Chief Infrastructure Officer for all of CTA. So Chris brings to bear, a lot of background and context for this project. And then I'll come back at the end with a few additional comments. So let me bring up the presentation. Okay, can everyone see the presentation? Yep, all right. So Red Purple Modernization, it's the current project is focused on the red line. I'll talk a little bit more about some future phases in a moment. But the work that we're doing right now is really focused primarily on the red line. The red line, for those of you who are maybe less familiar, is one of CTA's 8 heavy rail rapid transit lines. It is the busiest. It's basically the trunk line that runs from the north border of the city of Chicago through downtown to the south side. It also runs 24/7. It's one of only 2 rapid transit lines left in the CTA that has 24-hour service. And it serves some of the most densely populated neighborhoods, not only in Chicago, but in the US. The parts of the line date back to the 1890s. The parts that RPM is dealing with date primarily from that period, as well as the 1920s. Basically, north of downtown, it is pre-war in vintage. The middle section in the State Street subway dates from the 1940s, and then the south end in the Dan Ryan Expressway dates from the 1960s. As I mentioned, it's CTA's busiest line with 70 million riders annually last year. So the RPM project, RPM is Red Purple Modernization, actually involves more than just the red line. The complete umbrella program will rebuild all red and purple line stations and track systems all the way from Linden at the far north end of the purple line in suburban Wilmette, through Evanston, through the north side of Chicago, down to Belmont. That corridor from Linden to Belmont is 9.6 miles. And as you can imagine, reconstructing that entire length not only would be incredibly complex, but expensive to do all at once. So the project is broken up into multiple phases. The goal of the project is to add capacity and, of course, to prolong the service life of the infrastructure, most of which is reaching end of life. So the current project is really just phase one of RPM. It began in 2019 and will run through 2025. And the areas which I'll go over in just a moment for phase one were chosen for the initial project because they will bring maximum benefits to CTA customers across the rail system. Parts of it were some of the most deteriorated, but they also, being at the south end of the corridor, will benefit not only customers who actually live in the immediate project area, but the customers coming from farther north in the corridor all ride through this section. So the capacity improvements that it will bring, as well as the improved infrastructure, will be a benefit to everybody who rides through that corridor. So phase one consists of three projects. They are the Red Purple Bypass, which is a bypass track and track realignment at Clark Junction, just north of Belmont, where the brown line branches off from the red line. That will increase speed, reliability, and capacity. The Lawrence to Bryn Mawr Modernization is the reconstruction of 6 miles of track structure and 4 red line stations, a little bit farther north between Lawrence and Bryn Mawr stations. And then the corridor signal improvement improves the signal systems across 23 miles of track, which will improve service reliability. So phase one has benefits to both riders and the larger community. The new track structures, bridges, viaducts, and signals will provide faster, smoother rides. They'll be also quieter, so we'll be a better neighbor to the communities that we operate through and next to. They will permit more frequent service and less crowded service by increasing the capacity through the corridor. The 4 red line stations in the Lawrence to Bryn Mawr area will be rebuilt to not only be in better condition, but brighter, safer, and more be fully ADA accessible. Besides for the physical improvements that this will bring, it also brings economic development and growth. Both, of course, through our investment in the system and in the communities, but also through workforce development. In the construction brings a lot of economic and work opportunities, particularly for increasing SBE and DBE participation. And then post-construction, there's going to be a lot of opportunity for transit-oriented development to bring investment to the communities that our stations and infrastructure will buttress. The project, phase one, is funded through a few different mechanisms. It was the bulk of the federal funds come from the Core Capacity Program, which was actually, we're the first recipient, I should say, of Core Capacity funds. And it was a capital funding program that the federal government created to help legacy systems like CTA that need investment in order to remain viable and efficient and in a good state of repair. The local funding, as most of you are probably aware, federal funds require a local match. That can be a challenge sometimes when our local, state, and city partners sometimes have their own funding challenges. So a special TIF district was created by the Illinois General Assembly in 2015 and the City Council the following year to generate the local funds to be the match. But the TIF for this program is a little bit different from typical TIFs. The funding is solely dedicated to RPM rather than being available for general infrastructure projects. It also was created to address one of the concerns that the public often voices to TIFs, which is taking money away from public schools. And the RPM TIF, the transit TIF, was designed not to do that. Any property value increases that occur within the TIF district, the CPS will see those benefits rather than all of that extra money going to RPM. So some key issues and challenges for the project, and Chris is going to talk about these in more detail in the presentation further on, but just to touch on them briefly. One is replacing a 100-year-old structural system is always a great challenge. It's a challenge for staging, it's a challenge for what you're going to find, particularly for a lot of the distance in the LBMM area, the Lawrence to Bryn Mawr area, is a solid fill embankment. So it's a little bit of a mystery box, sometimes what you find in a 100-year-old embankment like that. But it's also being performed in a densely populated urban environment. So this creates not only practical challenges in terms of getting material in and out, staging for construction, but also we have neighbors who are right against our work zones. We need to be good neighbors to those communities, so that provides a challenge as well. Another is, very few CTA projects are greenfield projects. We're rarely building on virgin land. In this case, we have to keep our busiest rail line, the Red Line, operating through this project. So maintaining rail service during the construction period is a big challenge. Replacing the 50-year-old signal system. Systems integration is always a challenge for a project like this. And then meeting and exceeding DBE and workforce development requirements also poses some interesting challenges. So briefly, just a few photos for some context. As I mentioned, some of the infrastructure we're dealing with dates back to the 1890s. Here we see the construction of the southern portion of the project area. We see in the top left is construction of the 4-track elevated structure near Sheffield and Fullerton. Bottom left, same area, ready to begin erecting steel, which you see on the ground. And then on the right is the hoisting and placement of the steel structure. So this is what it looked like when they built what we are now replacing 100 years ago. At this point, I think I'll turn it over to Chris to speak to the current conditions and dive into some of the meat of phase 1.
Well, thank you, Graham. I want to talk for just a second about two people who are key to this project. One of whom obviously is talking or just got done talking, which is Graham Garfield. So many of you know Graham through this organization, and what an amazing job he's done with the CTA for a number of years. He has a unique position with this project in interfacing with our operations group, as well as providing important, and in that capacity, providing important sort of day-to-day communications directly to our passengers, or coordinating those communications going out through our various operations outlets, and then coordinating a larger message with our media and government community relations folks. But also in sort of advancing many of the standards for communication and signage that we see in the stations. So those of you that know him know that he doesn't need a lot of introduction in terms of the various roles he's played in the CTA. He has quickly become a key figure for us as we expand our presence on the railroad and need to have an incredible amount of communication and coordination with our major operations groups in rail and bus. And that and his historic perspective on the CTA make him an invaluable part of the project. And then, you know, I recognize Dorval and his importance in supporting the project in a number of roles, currently, obviously, as the president of the CTA. But I also want to call out someone and kind of as an advertisement for them, someone who's no longer with the project, but was an integral part of it for several years and a real determinant. And many of you may have worked with Steve. He was kind of my number 2 on the project for a while, and really first in planning and then with the RPM team did an amazing job to advance us from an environmental study perspective to a real project, and creating construction documents that reflected or procurement documents rather that reflected many of the aspects of planning, and really kind of locked us into a certain type of performance and delivery. His influence, although he's left to go into the private sector, I won't plug his firm while plugging him. He's an amazing guy. And if you haven't worked with Steve, he is certainly going to be a name that you should take down and remember, because he will show up as a leader in transit, if not in the city, in the state, and certainly across the country. Amazing young man with a bright, bright future. So speaking of bright futures, I think the Red Line has a bright future, although if you look at these slides, you may not recognize it. This piece of infrastructure has seen a significant amount of use, and I would argue from these pictures and then your own personal recollection of it, it's at the end of its service life. I'll say in the terms of the bottom right slide, at least bottom right for me, the slide with all the people in it, that it is a crowded line, and during rush hour it was operating at or above capacity in many stretches. So you kind of get a picture here of what the conditions are. I won't get into the technical details of kind of what you're seeing. I will add one thing to one of the driving reasons why we selected this stretch, the Lawrence to Bryn Mawr segment, rather than northernmost, well, the northernmost of the main segments, is because it was one of the largest blocks of inaccessible stations that we had in our system, and also an area that had a lot of transit dependent folks who were not able to use transit as efficiently as you might expect, because there was a number of people with physical disabilities who had a hard time getting to and from some of the stations. So kind of breaking up that block not only provides better throughput, better stations, and all the developments that Graham listed, but it also kind of breaks up this block of inaccessible stations that we had on the northern end of the Red Line. If we go to the next slide. There we go. So key dates. We started this project 2018 to current advanced utility relocation. Those of you involved with Norm, with Metro, or any other folks that are involved with transit, clearing your utilities out of the way in advance is really that, plus purchasing all your real estate in advance of bringing your contractor on was a key part of this project. I talked a little bit about Steve, and one of the things he brought, this was something he really helped to set up and bring about. It was a brilliant idea that has worked very well for us. We have by and large eliminated many of the major, all of the major, but many of the utility conflicts that we would face inside a job like this had we not designed and had an idea way ahead of procurement as to where the structure was going to go, how it was going to work, and then clear the utilities. 2019, we did the project groundbreaking. 2020, we started the pre-stage work. This is really predominantly the installation of 2 major interlockings at Montrose and Thorndale, so that we could switch the trains and build the Lawrence Bryn Mawr segments in 2 major phases. We were able to put these 2 major interlockings in record time. To some extent, it was making lemonade out of the lemons that COVID gave us, because we were able to do extended reroutes, over 3 and 4 weeks to install these 2 interlockings, at least the heavy civil track portion of them, instead of doing that work on weekends. So there is a significant advantage to the CTA and to our contractor in that effort. 2021, we look for the red purple bypass bridge to be completed. You'll see an animation of us going over that bridge in not too long. 2021 to 25, Lawrence to Bryn Mawr new station and track construction in 2 phases. And then, whoops, if we go back, 2019 to 2025, new signal system installation. So Pre-Stage was installing those two interlockings and actually a signaling system, preliminary signaling system or temporary signaling system between those two interlockings. We will ultimately come back and do the corridor signal improvement, which will put a new and higher capacity signal system in the entire corridor, Belmont up to Howard, one of the major aspects of this project. And I'll talk a little bit more in depth about that signaling system and how it's unique to the CTA. And then North Main reconstruction is reconstruction of the tracks under the bypass. So we have the bridge over, which is the bypass. We have the bridge under, which is the North Main, and then we have the bridge that's on top of the existing embankment, which is the Lawrence to Bryn Mawr segment, along with the stations. That North Main reconstruction is important to us because one of the things that slows us down is the CTA was built, you know, as more or less a private railroad 100 years ago, or by a private developer who didn't have the kind of eminent domain ability nor the engineering know-how that we do now. And so as we built this railroad very incrementally, we had a number of unique conditions, small curves, vertical and horizontal, that introduced speed restrictions. And what we're endeavoring to do with the bridge under is to take out some of the most prominent of those, again, increasing our ability to provide throughput and ultimately to provide safer and greater capacity to our customers. Okay, we can go to the, so we're going to talk a little bit about the bypass. This tour, if you can call it that, sort of starts at the south and moves north. So with that, we're going to start at the bypass. So we're adding capacity. I would guess that most people understand the basics of this project. You know, I'll just say this rather than reading through the points here. The last time any of you saw a stoplight in the middle of the Dan Ryan or the Kennedy Expressway, you know, was probably 70 or 80 years ago, a stoplight at either end or near it. Yet in some of our major railroads, we have stoplights in all sorts of places, flat junctions that create conflicting moves between the trains and severely impact our ability to maximize throughput. So it was pretty clear that Clark Junction was one of those that constrained predominantly the Red Line trains from reaching a full capacity, but also the Brown Line to Graham's mention earlier. So putting this bypass in was an important part of improving throughput in this corridor. I'll also say that in designing a major piece of infrastructure like this, we took into consideration the aesthetics. We had one of the leading architects in the city, EXP, working on this particular aspect of the bridge, as well as some of the stations that we'll talk about in summary later. But we took great care to introduce aesthetics that not only were beautiful of their own accord, as we hope in any case, but also, you know, endeavored to break up the massing of these elements to make them seem a little bit more friendly and integrated into the environment. It is hard to build a transportation bridge in the middle of a neighborhood and not have it stick out. To the extent which it sticks out, we try to take the spaces under and around it and create rooms for them. So we have some rooms that are quite public, like you'll see underneath. I don't know that rendering gives you all the effect that we were looking for, but we added a significant light beyond just the CDOT requirements, the City of Chicago Department of Transportation requirements, to create a more inviting space in there, as well as some just lighting that's really purely decorative, in order to create a room under that area that doesn't just look like something left over from a construction of a bridge, but looks like a place that would kind of draw you into and draw you through and provide visual interest to pedestrians and drivers in that area. So the aesthetics of this and the impact that it had on the community was something we integrated in as early into and as an integral part of the contract. I took many leads on this effort from some of the various things that are being done in Minnesota by a number of transportation planners and builders, and how they are considering the impact of their bridges and other things on the cities that they're serving. So I hope that once it gets done, some of that translates through, because I myself live in near the Pulaski and Irving Park in Chicago, and can feel the effect of construction of the highway and some of the track and CTA infrastructure, and how that can really, tear a neighborhood apart rather than unite it. And we were very conscious of that as we did the planning and construction, while still moving at kind of lightning speed, as you can see from we already have steel. If you look at my picture, you see a crane behind me. We're actually lifting steel onto these columns as we speak. All right, I'll keep going here. I don't want to slow down too much. Next. So we have an animation. I will endeavor to narrate it a little bit so you get some context. This is, again, a narration of the bypass, predominantly, both the bridge over and then the bridge under. All right, so you can see this is obviously an aerial view of how Clark Junction will be configured after the bypass is completed. You can see a brown line train moving north here. This was the move that created conflict between the two lines, and now is free. You can see here now we're on a purple line train, and we're on the tracks under. Those of you that have taken a careful look at these tracks over the years will notice the absence of the vertical and horizontal curves as this purple line moves through this area much smoother than it has before and approaches the Belmont station on track 1. All right, so now we have a brown line moving up and over. That is Clark Tower to the left. You'll notice that we conveniently miss it and come up and over the tracks now instead of those conflicting moves between the browns and the reds. You'll notice as well, this continues our development of closed deck trackage, which, as Grant mentioned before, offers us both maintenance improvements, ride improvements, as well as less impact to the community in terms of noise. Those of you that have had the opportunity to use the Wilson station and have had a moment maybe to stand underneath that station will appreciate what closed deck can mean to a community, as it's much quieter underneath it. You can actually talk to someone, which maybe isn't the case if you're downtown next to an elevated station. So construction progress, you've seen pictures of these completed, that we call them the tulips, the bypass column construction. Recent activities, we have done semi-permanent structure bracing, temporary track construction, pavement work. And then I mentioned a second ago as well that we started the erection of the steel for the bypass. This is a picture of the steel a couple of weeks ago in its setup yard in Missouri. You can see the Mississippi River behind you there in the photograph. This steel is now, at least half of it is on top of a couple of the columns in the bypass area. So one of the advantages, next slide, to design build is that we can move pretty fast in construction and design it. And we have for a partner in this effort, Walsh Fluor, obviously a national, one of the best national infrastructure companies, I would say, and Fluor, one of the best international companies. Both are making a significant impact in bringing this project forward. I will say that it is great having a hometown constructor here. Matt Walsh has taken an interest in this project, follows it, appreciates the hard work that we're all doing as a team to advance it, and has supported it, I think, as much as any owner and contractor can support and not only make the project happen, but go that extra distance. As we all know, it's necessary in this type of work. So here you, I think, get a little bit of more of a picture of how we've concentrated lighting in areas of pedestrian access, how we've tried to create decorative elements that call attention to the infrastructure in a positive way. And generally, like I said, try to create a room rather than just a leftover space that is a place where garbage and other stuff congregate, right? This is a place that people can walk through. It's a place you can have a business next to, a restaurant, and feel pride rather than necessarily just impact. So next slide. So moving north, the Lawrence to Bryn Mawr Modernization Station and track reconstruction. This is a unique section because we're introducing a couple different technologies here, one of which I'll talk about. Not introducing, it's been done before in Illinois, but not commonly. Next. It's a segmented box girder. So we are building 4 fully accessible stations, Lawrence, Argyle, Berwyn, and Bryn Mawr. We are reconstructing century-old track structure and repairing the embankment, although I'll say predominantly with a segmented box girder, we're dropping caissons through the existing embankment structure, and it really becomes more decorative than anything else because we're taking the load off of it by virtue of the installation of those caissons. That said, we're repairing the components that remain. You saw in earlier pictures what they look like now. So we're obviously not going to leave it there. And in many cases, big chunks of it get removed, and then the pieces that remain get repaired. But again, they don't continue to really carry any load because of the segmented box girder and the caissons underneath it. 2020 has been mostly pre-stage. We have, as I said, done 2 extended reroutes and then a lot of weekend work, but the extended reroutes, not something we could have ordinarily done under pre-COVID ridership, enabled us to accelerate the installation of 2 very important interlockings to the north and south of this segment. Next year, we look forward to the new station and track reconstruction beginning. You'll see a gantry crane out there, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and the reconstruction, and then subsequently the stations, and we'll start more completely the new stations in phase B. 2024, the construction of stations and track will be substantially complete. Next slide, please. I talked a little bit about this. I don't know if there's anything. We have 2 temporary stations. If I said to a bunch of people who have asked questions from the community, no, none of these stations stay open while we're reconstructing them. The reconstruction is so complete. What we're doing is sort of shifting and creating temporary stations where we have real estate to be able to do that. So these stations are pretty close together. The location of the 2 temporary stations, generally speaking, still maintains a level of service that we consider acceptable. And then, of course, we're completing the utility relocation work. Next slide. I'm proud of these interlockings. I've done a few of these, and they typically take much longer. There's a lot of team work that's required to get to this point. We needed a lot of support from our operations folks to do the extended reroutes, a lot of cooperation and quick pivots from our front office, as led by President Carter and his Chief of Staff, Veronica Alanis. And it has been, a whirlwind activity. I think one of the things we're dealing with now is just try to make sure that people weren't too burnt out by this work, because it was an intensive design lead up and then an intensive installation. And many folks on the contractor side were working, 12, 14-hour days, 6 to 7 days a week. And unfortunately, the pace hasn't slackened a lot. So we are at a project this long and this complex, thinking and talking about issues of sustainability within the staff. That's an important thing in a project this hard and this long. Next, please. Audio relay houses, that work is continuing. As I said before, one thing that's unique here is that our signaling system up there was not in good enough shape at the end of service life for us to be able to run the alternative service, particularly with the kind of headways that we required pre-COVID. So as a result, we not only put the new interlockings in, we also put a temporary signal system in, but by all accounts, a pretty much state-of-the-art temporary signal system that would enable us to run alternative service on very narrow headways to put all of our service through that 2-track corridor where they earlier went through 4. It's a pretty big effort to install a signal system, period, let alone a temporary signal system. And you might look at these slides and say, well, I don't see the temporary part of it. And you'd be right, because it is really temporary in configuration only. Many of the houses get repurposed for the new and larger corridor signal system to come. And they are designed in such a way that enable us to transition from an analog standard wayside signaling system to a digital one. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Some of these platforms and houses get repurposed in other locations as that corridor signal effort. But it is a big windup to the construction of the segmented box girder in the Lawrence to Bryn Mawr segment. Next, please. Temporary stations at Argyle and Bryn Mawr. These are, I think, masterfully constructed by Welsh Floor and their designer EXP, designed by EXP, to kind of weave into the areas that we could find in and around the existing stations that would enable us to continue to build the new segmented box girder and the new stations while still providing service. Again, you might look at the steel on the far right of Bryn Mawr, the stairs going up to the new side-loaded phase A station configuration and wonder what's temporary about that. But it isn't accessible. It's no less accessible than the current Bryn Mawr, but it isn't accessible in and of itself. And the platforms and other amenities are probably more in line with what's there now rather than what ultimately will come for our customers. But it still is a complex endeavor to make sure these stations can be built and available as we start phase A in the late spring of 2021, the construction of the segmented box girder Lawrence to Bryn Mawr. So I talked about the gantry crane. So this came into the procurement as an alternative technical concept or proposal. And it was one that we ultimately talked a lot about. It wasn't allowed in our base specification. And it came in as a proposal, special to this contractor who had erected or put together many of them across the country. And it was ultimately something we couldn't ignore because of the savings involved. And the savings were significant in another number of respects. They were significant in terms of the time for the entire project. They were also significant in terms of the impact. You could imagine that, this picture behind me, those of you can see my photograph, I can't see myself, but this big crane that's behind us is doing the erection right now for the more standardized steel structure in the bypass area. If we would have set that crane up adjacent these tracks, we would have seen continual impacts to existing revenue service as that crane swung around and moved segments in, or structure into place. We would have seen impacts to the community in terms of adjacent construction. So not only did the segmented box girder offer us predominantly longer spans, we actually cut the number of caissons by more than half. It also reduced the impact associated with the construction of those segments, and it also enabled us to have the quality control that we see from pre-constructed concrete, which I'll add is constructed in the region and provides valuable jobs to the region in its fabrication. So a lot of wins sort of nestled in this concept. A win to our customers going through there who don't see the same sort of flagging impacts you would see with a tall tower crane or other type of heavy crane that would be used to do these, and also to the community, which sees a smaller footprint in the area adjacent the construction. So there's approximately 1,000 segments of this. I can answer some questions, more technical questions. We'll see a few slides here that I'll kind of hammer through a little bit about some of the geometry control. Well, here you get a picture for what this looks like. How we're constructing it. This is stage B. I don't remember the exact purpose of this slide. Well, I guess you see how it's divided. We have a construction area and a rail service area in stage B. Next slide. Segment reinforcement. I'm going to kind of go through these quickly. If folks have questions or issues about this, how this is done. There's been a big learning curve for the CTA. We brought in experts from across the country who have done these bridges, predominantly on the two coasts to help us. But we have a brilliant precaster out in Morris, Illinois, UCP, who's done a great job with this, and a very solid general contracting team who has, I think, done a great job with the quality and the particulars of this. Next slide. A lot of this becomes about quality control on this. We have a high degree of that here. A lot of it is the geometry of the individual segments, the type of systems These form work that you see sort of around the rebar before the pour, those were all manufactured in China and then shipped over to the United States. They were manufactured by an Italian concern that has production facilities in China. They were actually manufactured in Wuhan and were held up for a little bit at the early stages of COVID, but they did make it over here, all 4 of them, and we're currently casting on schedule for all of the segments. Next, please. An additional feature of this type of work is this geometry control, and this amounts to very carefully match casting the various segments next to each other. So you always have, after the first segment, you always have one next to it that you have the next adjacent segment that you're matching to. And then you're feeding all the coordinates in from various survey points. And the computer, there's a computer program, proprietary program, that adjusts the particular geometry of each of those segments so that we get a high degree of precision in the assembly of the bridge components. Next, please. Concrete placement. The factory out in Morris has a very efficient way of batching, making the concrete and then delivering and placing it into the forms. Next. Next. You can see in the assembly of these are not Chicago. They're just various examples to give folks an idea of how this works. You can see the gantry in 2 of these, actually in all 3 of these slides, in various components, and get an idea of how they're loaded in. We don't load them in exactly like this. We actually bring them to the site. We put them on a rail-borne shuttle and move them down into position. You'll see that in just a second in our slides. Next. Here we go. So segment erection, install and anchor the gantry at pier, lift and adjust the segments. I won't go through all of these. Again, if there are any questions at the end, the most important thing to bear in mind with this type of construction is, the CTA, you can look at our recent efforts at Wilson and marvel at the amount of steel that's there. And I think it's beautiful. Also a Walsh-built station. But, the amount of steel, the amount of resource, the distance of the spans, transit is never going to have the kind of money that the tollway has or that other highways have, even in jurisdictions that have tons of money like LA and New York. And I think that we're always going to need to be industry leaders in adapting efficient technology, and where we can cut the number of caissons in half, something that is arguably one of the hardest parts of our construction, and get longer. We have basically in our RPM double the spans from 60 to 50 feet to 100 to 110 feet. The fewer places we touch the ground, the more efficient our construction is, and the better we can deliver and quicker we can deliver this process and project. So the introduction of this technology to the CTA is I love steel. I think it, as you go down, say, Lake Street in the summer day and see the shadows on the street, it is a unique part of the history of this city. But I want transit to be part of the future of this city. And in order to do that, we need to build lighter rail cars. We need to build lighter and more intelligent structures. And in our own way, I think we've been able to reconcile the very real day-to-day requirements we have with the trains that we have and the ways that we have, yet still make it more efficient. So to me, that's the most significant thing that we've introduced here. And I would guess that in various ways, if we can continue to push this level of efficiency, this will be the system that we will use to rebuild other vital places of the CTA, like the downtown area, which unfortunately is also at capacity at the moment and will eventually need to be reconstructed in a more efficient way. So outside of tunneling, this is probably the most efficient way for transit to build bridges. Next. Next. Details. If anyone has questions on grouting, I'm happy to answer them later. So the new signal corridor improvements, this is an exciting thing. I mean, signaling is exciting mostly because the industry is in crisis, the signaling industry, and it is desperately stretched thin between the work that it's doing for America's freight railroads and the work it's doing for America's transit. There aren't enough people doing it. There aren't enough engineers that know how to do it, either for CTA or for various engineering companies, let alone the manufacturers. So that makes signaling exciting as a project manager, start to finish. But what's really exciting here is that we are introducing in a couple of different places, not just this project, but also our signaling project on the blue line, the digital track circuit to the CTA, which gives us a lot of the capacity of communication-based train control, but not the expense and burden of having to coordinate a signaling project with a rail vehicle project, something that would stretch the capacity of most legacy railroads. Next, please. So we demonstrated, as part of other projects, we had 2 signaling companies put in digital track circuits prior to bidding RPM. It was an interesting test. We got a lot of good information from it. We ultimately went forward with 2 signaling systems, one with Hitachi and the other with Alstom. They're both frankly struggling to put the technology in place, partly due to COVID for sure. I mean, we have, Hitachi, this track circuit is coming from Italy. It's been used extensively in Europe and is now being developed. We're very satisfied with it as a product, but Italy is a severely impacted country, and getting engineers over here and getting information back and forth has been complicated. But just in general, the industry is highly constrained by the resources that are available. So the other, Alstom is facing a similar circumstance on the blue line right now. They are also very challenged in meeting the current schedule. So you can see here the timeline, 19 to 21 CSI design and DG tracks testing. We have tested the DG circuit off one of our major revenue lines again. And we're now getting ready to put it in a test on one of our revenue lines, and then we will be installing it at the successful conclusion of that test throughout. In the most close term, we've been installing a more standard alternative system, as I mentioned before, as part of our pre-stage effort. Next slide. So one advantage to the digital track circuit is that we can move towards the functionality of communication-based train control more incrementally. We go forward now. This system, this digital track system, is configured to work with existing analog train car packages as well as future digital ones. We don't, in the current configuration, get all the benefits. We really start to see those benefits come to fruition as we incrementally update the fleets, as we will incrementally update the fleet's car signal package. So we get to kind of keep the existing cars in place. The system that will install the digital system will first be compatible with their analog car packages, and then later realize many of the benefits as we put in digital train packages. So it is something that enables the legacies to move towards reduced headways and greater efficiency for our customers without having to do more wholesale vehicle replacements and timed purchases with new vehicles, which is tricky. I mean, it's hard enough to get the new vehicles out there. You know, as many of you know, we're currently testing the 7000s out there, much to we're testing the patience a little bit of our vehicle folks as we do work on the RPM, but they are finding their slots to run their cars. It's hard enough to bring those on board without trying to time it to a project the size and complexity of RPM, which is one reason why you see many of these projects fail on the national level, or at least be extremely stressed, is the need to coordinate and commission all of that stuff. So we've taken a more incremental approach that we think will give many of the benefits of communication-based train controls without some of the costs and risk. Next. So the modern technology to represent not just an upgrade to the system, but a step towards a modern system, including, these are some of the features of the digital track circuit: train detection via secure messaging between transmitter and receiver, synthesized analog signals for cab carrier and cab speed codes, train to wayside communications for bidirectional data exchange, precision berthing, potentially automatic train operation, red signal enforcement. So that is a big topic for us from a safety perspective. And then an Ethernet interface for communication with adjacent processors and to support remote diagnostics. That's probably a little bit in the future for us, but it is an important aspect as we become a more efficient railroad to be able to diagnose, to be able to understand problems and fix them as quickly as we can. Next. So one important part of these projects, and certainly one that our board took a major interest in and our political mentors took an interest in, was workforce development and SBDB conclusion and inclusion. And, you know, I think we set the bar pretty high here in a couple of different ways. One, we had 20% DB for design, and then 20% DB for construction, which was unique because we had heard as we moved to design build at the CTA over the last few years, getting ready for this project, we heard from some of our designers, our DB designers, that they were being left at the wayside because the requirements didn't apply to them, and the contractors would find their compliance in some of the trades and ignore the fact that there were smaller design firms out there that we wanted to support as well. So Welsh Floor has aggressively jumped into this. They are treating the goal as the floor and not the ceiling. So they're working to go beyond it. It is, as these national projects go, those of you that are familiar with them, it is a very high goal. Our partners in Boston and New York and LA, as aggressive and interesting as they are, have lower goals. So we are, I think, setting a high watermark for this effort. And then we're also working a lot on workforce goals. You know, we are trying to develop our opportunities for a broad range of the city. We're trying to make sure that as the CTA serves the city, so too are the jobs available to the people in all areas of the city in an equitable and fair manner. So we've worked very hard at this. If we can go to the next slide. We, I think, have some examples of, you know, specific, we have continually tried not just to kind of come back to the numbers, you know, the percentage of hours, but also some of the stories and some of the examples that people are setting. You know, one of the various ways that we were able to create lemonade out of lemons in these extended reroutes to put in the pre-stage interlockings was it also required the contractors to do some additional hiring. And so Railworks, the subcontractor to Welsh Floor doing the track work, ended up hiring 15 individuals. And as it notes here, 9 were WIOA eligible, 4 were apprentices, and 11 were from economically disadvantaged areas. We feel like this is just a necessary part of doing business, and it has been a big lift for us to work with the contractor. The contractor has had to put a lot of work and effort into it. But generally speaking, they have shown, you know, world-class leadership in advancing this as a goal. Next, please. We also, in terms of SBDB inclusion, one of the success stories here is our building small business programs, where we've sought not just to require the contractor to use DBs, but also to build their capacity. So what we've done is we've brought these contractors in. We've brought a vendor, and the contractors brought a vendor in, a great vendor who did this work, similar work in Denver. And now we're doing it. We're kind of taking their lead and integrating it into the CTA diversity effort. So we went virtual with it. This building small business program has helped small contractors participate in projects like RPM. We've been able to not only listen to them, help them develop business plans, but also arrange for them to have various types of funding. So you can see here that after COVID, the building small businesses pivoted and mobilized to help businesses apply and receive more than $4 million in Triple P and CARES funding, including businesses like the one featured at left here. So, I mean, this is a great effort. Our diversity group has done a wonderful job. Tom McCone, Juan Pablo Prieto have done really great work in coordinating with us and coordinating with our contractor to maximize these opportunities. We feel this is a really integral part of any big project, is to demonstrate not just the improvements to our riding public, but to demonstrate the improvements to the public as a whole, particularly those who have the biggest challenges on a day-to-day basis. And, you know, it couldn't have happened at a better time, because so many other businesses are going the other direction for us to be able to hire and promote people that have skills and desires to succeed is really an amazing benefit of this project. Next. Community outreach. Well, again, speaking of, COVID impacts, we have seen COVID probably be more of an impact to our business communities than we could maybe ever be, but we also see the opportunity to help them more than ever, and have bent over backwards to try to do a community outreach effort. So we have put up advertising. We've created digital click-through opportunities where people can get information about the impacts to the project, and then also say, hey, it's 5 o'clock on a Tuesday and it looks like you're going home, so why don't you click through and look at these restaurants? The digital world can not just provide information of impacts to our customers. It could then sort of say, okay, you've got your information. Now, here's some, commercial, things that you might be interested in the neighborhood, and offer discounts and do other things that reinforce what's going on. I mean, when people get off at a new temporary station, or will get off at it, as we start phase A of the Lawrence to Bryn Mawr segment, and they may not be as familiar with some of the restaurants or retail establishments in that area. So giving them not only the data about where to go and how to use a temporary station, but then also to plug them into a local business and offer a discount and move them into that is a huge advantage, and we're trying our best to take care of it. So it's not just sort of the standard, pardon our dust. We're moving significantly beyond that in the digital age, and I think at an appropriate time, because so many of these businesses are so severely impacted by what's happened in our city over the last 8 to 9 months. Next. Well, this is Graham. This is just one page of his brilliance here. Is just these day-to-day communications, knowing where to put them, how to put them up here. So I'll turn it back to him, because he's really the best person to explain this slide.
So we'll have just a couple more slides, and then we'll wrap up so we have some time to take questions. But a couple last things to touch on. One is, in addition to community outreach, is the customer outreach. And of course, in many cases, they're some of the same folks, the people who live in the immediate project area, who also utilize our transit service. But of course, there's a lot of folks who just ride through this corridor. They may start or end their trips further north or further south, but they see some impacts as well. So it's very important for CTA to reach out to its customers, to its passengers, as we have to maintain transit service during construction. And so when we need to do reroutes, or we need to temporarily bypass a station or other service impacts, we really try to use an assortment of different materials and a diverse network of channels to get the information out as widely as possible, and also to give people sort of a choice of how to absorb it, how to obtain it, so that we're not forcing people to only go to one place to get the information. So just a few of the different ways that we get information out about service changes or impacts. The good old tried and true paper customer alerts we still post in stations. It's very analog, but it's cheap and it's easy to do, and it doesn't rely on technology. It sort of is a very baseline thing to do. But that same information is also posted online, and when it's posted online, it is syndicated through what's called an API, which is basically a data feed that other websites can pick up. And so our information, by just posting it to our website, can automatically get syndicated out to other websites, apps, and digital platforms as well. We have digital screens in our stations, as one of the photos shows, and so we make sure to put alerts and service information on those screens. We utilize the PA system in our stations to make announcements both in advance and during service changes. And then we also have the rail operators make special manual announcements during reroutes and service impacts to sort of help guide customers along. So they may have read something online or in the station, but then when they're boarding the train, they get sort of an extra helping hand from the operator. We leverage social media, our Twitter feed, our Facebook, to get this information out as well, in addition to answering questions, since those are interactive platforms. Customers can also sign up to have the alerts sent to them, so they don't even have to go look for them. They can get pushed out automatically, either by text message or email, depending on their preference. For some bigger types of work, we'll also do some additional outreach, like flyering both in stations and in the community, put up posters and other types of additional materials that may provide more information or maybe a little bit more context for why bigger impacts are happening. And then we use some of those community outreach channels that were mentioned on the previous slide, including elected officials and aldermanic offices to help distribute information, community groups and organizations, things of that nature. Finally, as both Chris and I have mentioned, one of the big challenges of this project is that we have to keep running a railroad while we're doing this construction. And service has to, still be regular, reasonably regular, stable, basically have the carrying capacity and the attractiveness to still, appeal to customers. So part of how we've made this a success is by baking in a lot of coordination back in the planning and contract phases. When the project was being developed, the project team did a lot of meeting and coordinating and discussing with CTA's planning department and transit operations, bus and rail, to talk about what kinds of different reroutes were likely to be needed, how many would be reasonable, what could be done in what combination. So it ended up being a rather granular list of different types of impacts, reroutes, single tracks, line cuts, things like that, that not only what was allowed, but what could be done in different combinations. And so it gave not only the contractor sort of a sandbox to play in, but also gave CTA's internal stakeholders a seat at the table early on, and then sort of a guiding document later on. Not that that doesn't then sometimes get deviated from, but it provides a good basis for those conversations. So as I mentioned, that all gets woven into the contract. And then we, of course, have regular, in addition to ad hoc conversations all the time, there's regular weekly and semi-weekly meetings with different internal stakeholder groups, including our service planning group, our bus operations, transit, rail operations, so that we're keeping them updated on project progress, what service impacts are coming up. If there's things they need to flag, it can be flagged early on so that we can work constructively with them to identify mitigations or maybe some alternate approaches to complete that work in a safe and efficient way, but also meets their needs as the ones managing the day-to-day service. So that relationship is very important, and it's one that RPM has really dedicated a level of attention and personnel to that's really beyond any project CTA's done in the past, and I think it's paid off for us in helping smooth the way for some creative solutions to some dynamic problems that we've encountered. So.
With that, I want to close out. I do want to do one more shameless plug for a really amazing young person who's involved with transit, has nothing to do at the moment with RPM, although she was pretty important to it early on, and is now going to be on Chicago Tonight, I think, talking about RLE tonight, Leah Mooney. So I will put that shameless plug in there for Chicago Tonight. If any of you get an opportunity to look at it, I think Leah will be talking about the Red Line Extension project, probably the next large project. She'll say it's the largest project in the history of the CTA. I might still say RPM is the largest, but in all good fun, it'll be interesting to watch. And Leah also is a star at the CTA, someone who will be leave their significant mark on on our organization. So if you get a chance, tune into Chicago tonight this evening. So with that, I know we've gone a little long, but if there are any questions, I'm happy. I think Graham and I are both happy to stick around and answer them. And it looks like there's 80 people that participated in this, so great. Thank you all. And if there's anything any questions we can answer, throw them up there and we'll take them. I think we're getting these either through Joan or through
me, Graham, or for Brett.
There we go. Yep.
Hopefully everyone can hear me. Hi, I'm Brett Johnson. I'm the Senior Associate Director of NUTC. Chris and Graham, you've got a really thorough presentation on this project, so we appreciate it. We probably have to wrap, and since you gave such a presentation, we're running a little bit over, but you already mentioned that you would stick around for a few questions, and we've probably wrap up sometime within about 10 or 15 minutes, just to give the audience some expectations. I'm going to read through some of the questions as I've received them. I'm going to try not to repeat questions from the same person, and we'll just try to spread it out a little bit.
Can I cut in really quick? Can we do
Sure, John.
screen sharing so that people can see all?
Oh, stop sharing the presentation.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is a nice logo though, very nice.
just trying to plug the brand.
All right, and Norm, if you'd like to unmute your screen too, we'd love to have you on the video Zoom with us. So let's start off. The first question I have is from, and forgive me if I repeat anything that you already addressed, you can let us know. Elias Gordon asks, will there be any opportunities for subcontractors and suppliers to bid on future RPM work? How are these advertised? Where can bidders go to get relevant information?
The best place to go, and we'll endeavor we'll work with the organization if this gets posted on a website or on our website to provide those links adjacent to it. But Walsh Fluor has an extensive effort set up to intake businesses and provide various opportunities, particularly for DBEs. So there are a lot. This is a tremendous rolling opportunity. There isn't just sort of one bite of this apple. These opportunities are being rolled out incrementally. And in some way, a big design build project like this, based on the way we set it up contractually, is actually sort of the biggest unbundling of various opportunities, because they are continuously occurring as we incrementally complete design and or roll into various phases of construction. So it's pretty important not to just look at it at one point in time, but to get involved through the Walsh Fluor website or Walsh's procurement effort and express your interest specifically for this project. But again, as we post this, we'll endeavor to have some links there that will be of assistance in this matter.
Thanks. Emmanuel Horowitz asks, does CTA ever use bus bridge substitution around a work site, or always maintain at least one track of actual live service during rebuilding?
Yes.
Okay.
Frequently to both. And in many cases, we do both, depending on the level of service. So sometimes we'll run a reroute with a back ride. And depending on the severity of the back ride, we'll provide alternative service with buses as well. And that would be in addition to an adjacent bus route. So what we'll effectively do is put alternative service on the street that more or less matches the headway of the service that we're interrupting. So again, even in some back rides where technically there's still continuous service, we'll provide those bus shuttles. And that's baked into the project. It's baked into we have contractual maximums for public way access occurrences as well as track access occurrences, and have built a budget to support the alternative service associated with both.
Thanks, Chris. Raymond Hall asks, what was learned from the Southwest Transit project that has proven helpful in the RPM project? Is that not relevant?
The Southwest, are you referring to the
Midway
Midway branch?
Maybe that's what he's referring to.
No, that's actually an excellent question. It predates me a little bit, but not that much. I will say that that project has been an inspiration in a number of ways. I mean, not the least of which would be some of the bridge building that occurred during there, but also the quality of that work, and some of the people that worked on it. My counterpart on the Welsh floor side, my co-executive, worked on that project, on the Orange Line project, I believe, Dave Shire. So it was a brilliant project. Out of all the pieces of infrastructure that the CTA uses, that one has probably had the best service life for its track systems and its stations. And there is a standardization to the design of the stations that we have shied away from a little bit, because so many of our communities within this project area are very unique. But the fundamentals of it are there, and I just think that was a brilliant project to sort of take away a bus garage and a more expensive, more impactful way of transit service and put in a more efficient one. There isn't the same sort of thought that we're going to build better service and therefore reduce bus service in this project. But many of the ways that it was constructed, many of the ideas, and then some of the people continue to impact our RPM project. So yes, if you would have said the Orange Line, I would have gotten that one quicker, but that is a
I
very
just read questions. I'm not trying to translate them yet. It's hard enough. But good, thanks for commenting on that. Martin Green asks, he says, a lot of real estate was cleared to make way for the red purple line bypass. Are there any plans to mitigate the impacts? Any new development opportunities in process?
Well, I would say that, the types of impacts, the CTA reduced its footprint and its footprint considerations significantly in the construction of this project to minimize the number of takings. So that was, we backed away from what would be considered industry standards and used in many of these projects across the country to narrow our footprint in such a way that we minimize the takings right out of the gate. So I'm not saying it wasn't significant in that particular area at all. I'm just saying people should understand that we consciously tried to minimize those takings going into this project, because minimize real estate costs, but also minimize impacts to the community. At the same time, and this is one of Steve Hans's, most brilliant efforts, was to do a transit-oriented development study, where ahead of those impacts, we got together with the community, the aldermen, the city, and sort of said, well, what do you guys want as we complete this project and the use of these properties to build our structure or to use as laydown yards? What does the community want? And that's where we got many of these ideas that you saw. I talked about rooms and how these spaces interact. That transit-oriented study kind of brought forward those considerations, and ultimately, when we leave that area, as we complete the infrastructure, we're going to be letting those properties that we were using for laydown yards for redevelopment. And we are, to the extent we're able to, in our laws that set up our agency, will sell those properties in a way that respects the vision that was established in that study. So it was a very important aspect of our work. I think we are doing it again, or will do it again, I believe, on RLE. I hope I'm not getting in trouble from Leah by saying that. But I think it's an important concept of how the CTA intends to work going forward in constructing these major projects in and around the community, which is we got to take some land to do this. We think it's worthwhile to our customers and to the community. And once we leave, we want to make sure that we're fostering a development that's supported by the community's aims and visions, because we're not a private developer, we're a community service provider.
Norm, before I ask a related question, are there any questions you wanted to ask of Chris or Graham?
No, because Graham and I talk about this project continuously, but I do want to make some final comments.
Okay, well, let's try one or two more questions, and then I'll hand it back to you, Norm. So related, Chris, to that last answer, Bennett Peterson asks, how many properties were actually taken during eminent domain, and do you know what the land use of those properties were prior to CTA's procurement of those lands?
Oh, that's really reaching into the cobwebs for me, but I think there was approximately 20 parcels that we took. I mean, how that would break down into anyone's concept of a property, basically a property, but some of them were larger. larger buildings. There was a fairly, a multi-unit condominium that was one of the takings along Wilton. Land use, they were a mixture of they were mixed use properties, some residential, some commercial. I would say they probably tended a little bit to residential, but for a project this large, so first of all, predominantly we're building on our own right of way. It's not a greenfield project. We are rebuilding our existing infrastructure, and where we are expanding is generally in the area where we're doing stations and increasing the width of the platforms, excepting the bypass, of course. But we have made an effort, as I said, to reduce that number of property. The number that going in on the planning stage before we really looked at tightening up our envelope was much higher, particularly in the area of the Lawrence to Bryn Mawr segment. So I think it's important. It's hard. It's more expensive. It's more difficult. We are much closer to things than we would, I guess, be comfortable on. We could probably build them a little more efficiently if we weren't so close, but it does reduce the impacts. Takings are controversial in almost every aspect. We try to minimize that and make sure that we were being a good neighbor and ultimately focus on servicing the community in an overall sense. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry if I can't give you more, but I think it was approximately 20 packages and they were predominantly residential and commercial.
I think it did. So one other, just a very specific question. Dustin Clark wants to know if you've measured decibel levels at street or sidewalk levels between the closed track decks at Wilson and under portions of existing tracks along RPM. Like, presumably, just where do they fit in with standards, I'll add.
Well, generally, I would say that we're, as a train, depending on your location and your proximity, trains our trains on elevated tracks are roughly 100 decibels. I would say that we're probably under a closed deck closer to 60 or 70, but I might be a little optimistic in that because of the logarithmic nature of decibels. That would be a very high reduction in the noise level. It's significant. It's significant enough that you can feel it. It's significant enough that you can have a conversation underneath the tracks at Wilson when there's a train going over, where you can't in an elevated station with an open deck. So I would say the reduction is approximately 20 decibels. If that seems believable. If anyone's an expert out there and wants to call foul on this, I'm happy to. But I know that the trains are about 90 to 100, and my sense is that we're 60 to 70 at places like Wilson. But that might be a little high, again, understanding the logarithmic nature of decibels.
Well, thanks for giving it at least your best guess, right? I'm going to end with one workforce development question, then turn it over to Norm. And we didn't get to all the questions, but I want to go back to Elias Gordon for this question. He wanted to know what skills are required for signal engineers, actual experience, can community colleges fill this void?
Mm-hmm. Honestly, I've seen really solid signal engineers that have come up as electricians, with a high school education and technical training. That would be the exception rather than the rule. Generally, these are positions that students approach as either electrical engineers of one sort or stripe, communication engineers, which is maybe a form of electrical engineering that specializes in more comm-based concerns, computer engineering, or I've actually seen several mechanical engineers start off in track and develop an understanding. So civil engineers developing an understand, civil or mechanical, develop an understanding in the dynamics of a track system, and then move over to signaling. So I've seen that happen, but an integral part of that is practical experience with either an engineering firm or a transit agency themselves, preferably. But the industry is in absolute crisis. It cannot fulfill all of its requirements, and we see this every day in almost every project. I mean, you could bore down into any major transit project and find some sort of signaling challenge that's due to an industry or an expertise constraint. So if I was a young person with an inclination towards railroads and with good technical skills, I would strongly consider a career in signal engineering. You will not be bored, and you will always have work.
Well, hopefully that'll inspire some or some on our Zoom call here who will inspire others. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Norm. Thanks again, Chris, for answering the questions we had today.
Well, first of all, Chris and Graham, thank you very much for an outstanding presentation. And I want to apologize to Graham that I didn't say more about him. Graham and I go back the better part of 20 years and have worked together on many history projects, and I can see him shaking his head, don't worry about it. But unfortunately, due to technical difficulties, I missed getting together the coordination meeting we had earlier today. Let me add to the signal engineering issue. Part of that, Chris, is of course the PTC installations in the freight railroad industry and some of the advances in technology that just in general, the freight railroads and the commuter railroads want to have in signal technology going forward. But let me just broaden it a little bit and say to anybody who's in engineering, any disciplines in engineering, construction management included, if you're interested in a long-term career, consider the railroad industry and particularly the passenger railroad industry, because that's where a lot of investment is being made at this point. The other thing I want to thank both Graham and Chris for is the conversation about the communication requirements that are needed in projects of this nature. I think most people miss that. I think the focus on the advances in construction and signaling are extremely important, and thank you for including that. But the area where I really want to talk about very quickly is the community outreach that is so necessary in these programs, number one, because we are impacting the communities perhaps somewhat a little bit negatively during the construction period, but very positively when it's over. But even more important that to me personally, and what we are doing at Metra is the workforce development and what I refer to as economic development through the use of small and disadvantaged businesses. So I think all of this is very, very important for people to understand and what surrounds the actual construction that is going on out there. So again, Chris and Graham, thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful presentation. It is December, what? I don't remember off the top of my head, that Tony Hatch is our next presentation, and that we'll be getting announcements on that. Tony is our annual presenter and kind of is the lead into the holiday season for us. And he will be giving us his financial analysis of the railroad industry as well. And with that, thank you for attending. We hope to see you at our December session. And hopefully Chris and Graham will have you back in maybe a year or so to give us another update on the project.
I'd enjoy that.
And with that, we will adjourn this meeting. Thank you for attending.
No.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.